Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here. Once again, it's time for the Q&As, and this week I decided to go ahead and do these over my training footage from earlier this week. And if you guys really want to know what I'm doing there, just go back and watch the training footage. But this is a lot easier than you guys just having nothing to look at, and I find doing these as a voiceover is actually a little bit easier, so I'm going to continue to do this for a little while. Alright, first question. I and my friends are discussing this term, can you eat junk food and still get big and strong, gain muscle, or do you need to eat healthy to get big? When I say junk food, I mean pizza, tacos, hamburger, stuff like that. Alright, brother, your spelling is absolutely atrocious. Please work on that next time. It was hard to read, but good question overall, so let's go ahead and answer that. As far as things that people think of as junk food making it more difficult to gain muscle, no, not at all. As long as you have a calorie surplus, in theory, just enough protein. I mean, it almost doesn't matter. I mean, carbs make it easier to gain muscle, but people can gain muscle on really high fat diets and everything else. The main thing, as long as training fuel is there and you don't have any major nutritional deficiencies, yeah, you're going to gain muscle just fine. The only concern there comes with it is going to be general health and maybe in the long term. In other words, if you're not eating a reasonably balanced diet and you're living on pizza and tacos and hamburgers and everything, you're getting a lot of trans fat, you're getting a lot of saturated fat in your diet, you're maybe not getting ideal things in your diet, and over the long term you might see a reduction in your performance because you might not be recovering ideally due to nutritional deficiencies, and maybe have long-term issues with insulin sensitivity and stuff, which it may not necessarily limit the amount of muscle that you're going to gain, but it might make gaining fat with that muscle slightly more problematic. And people need to understand that. They say things like, well, you can't get big and even lean on junk food. Sure you can. You absolutely can. Plenty of people have proven it over and over and over. So when people say that, that's just an opinion they're expressing, not based upon provable observations, because we know people who've done it. We've all seen people do it. But the problem is that it's a short-term thing, meaning, yeah, you might even be really jacked and lean following a mostly junk food diet for 5 years or 10 years. You're probably going to need drugs eventually to maintain that, because you are going to see some deteriorations in health and recovery and other things. And the problem becomes, in the long term, is it a viable strategy? Probably not. It's probably not going to be ideal, because again, once some of these things start to affect things like insulin sensitivity, once you realize, again, you're probably eating a much higher fat diet, and we're not even talking about good fats at this point, then what's ideal, you are probably going to see performance and recovery eventually start to stagnate from this. And it's a matter of genetics and how extreme you're going with it to determine how long that's going to be. But yeah, in the short term, sure you can. It's just that in the long term, it's just not a viable strategy. And again, I'm assuming you're talking about eating a largely junk food diet. It's pretty unlikely that 1 or 2 junk food meals a week is going to significantly impact someone's performance, health, anything like that. It's a matter of how you're moderating these things. The problem is that some people can't moderate these things, which is where it becomes a problem. All right, next question. Is it really true 5x5 is significantly better for growth compared to 3x5? I don't really believe that, because 3x5 allows for better recovery, which means more tonnage can be moved, meaning better growth. 5x5 causes a lot more stalling and deloading. It just doesn't seem like it's worth the extra 2 sets. A lot of that comes down to what you are doing with it. And I think people need to understand 5 sets of 5 with a relatively heavy weight, something in the 85% range, is difficult to recover from if you're relatively strong. But the thing is, when we're talking about noobs who are lifting, first of all, noobs can usually recomposition to some extent. So what you see with noobs, if they eat a relatively heavy amount of calories, they can train really hard, they recover really easy, and they gain minimal fat unless they started out already fat. So kind of the whole point here is that because someone who's really weak, let's say you come in the gym and you squat less than 200 pounds for your 5 rep sets, that's just not difficult to recover from. Work capacity increases the stronger you get, but it's not always in ratio to the amount of tonnage you can produce. What you find is that as people start to get stronger, 5 sets of 5, can become more and more difficult to recover from. Also because noob gains and things are done, people might not be eating as large of a caloric surplus. There's a nutritional component in there as well, unless they are bulking pretty hard, and that's what you're going to find. Once someone gets relatively strong, doing 5 sets of 5 might be difficult to maintain on multiple exercises without a very large caloric surplus. Now, the factor that we could go in with on that is that someone could, in theory, cut down to less sets on less important exercises, and they could still do 5 by 5 on, say, one exercise that's important to them. But 5 by 5 will always be fantastic for growth. It's just that maintaining it on 3 or 4 different exercises every week, particularly if you're doing them multiple times a week, that's where the problem kicks in, when you get so strong that you can surpass your own recovery ability doing 5 by 5. Because people need to understand strength and the amount of tonnage that you can move can absolutely impact recovery, and so that's probably what we're talking about here. But for a noob lifters are not capable. They're not capable of overtraining with 5 sets of 5. They're not strong enough to create enough tonnage for it to be an issue for them, as long as they are eating sufficient calories and getting sufficient sleep. And that's what we're talking about here. As you get a little more advanced, yes, it's a different story. So it might be the case of people either who aren't really eating enough or struggling with 5 by 5, or people who have built up a strong enough strength base that it starts to become problematic, which is why even on my novice program, I've recommended people at a certain threshold cut back to 3 by 5. It's just too much. All right, next question. How come Michael Hearn is totally fine despite using tons of gear, and that too for so long, Jason? Well, the thing is, it's like I said in the other video the other day, Mike might not be using tons of gear. All right, he's obviously not natural, and anyone who thinks that he's natural is absurd, either absurdly naive and new to the game, or they're a complete moron who's clearly never been around drugs versus real natty lifters. They've never been around, they haven't been around this stuff for 5 or 6 or 10 years. So the point is not that he's necessarily using large amounts. He may not be. When you think about it, the fact that he has made nice gradual progress over the last few decades means that he might not be blasting huge amounts of gear. I mean, someone like Mike could be using relatively small numbers. He could be using modest amounts of testosterone with pharmaceutical grade growth hormone, and like other people noted in there, he's got the connections, he's got money, he could be getting legitimate pharmaceutical stuff. He could be under the care of a medical doctor who's watching his blood work, watching all these things and maintaining his health there. You need to remember there's a difference between guys who are using moderate amounts under the care of a medical doctor versus people who are buying large amounts of black market gear and blasting stuff and not necessarily getting anything monitored. There's a big difference, and having an overall very healthy lifestyle with it, it's probably fine. But here's the thing. What do you mean for so long and he's still okay? How do you know that? And that's the other question too. He's only in his 40s. He's only in his 40s. Yeah, you're seeing guys like Rich Piana having problems, but you're seeing the abuse of polydrug abuse involved. You're seeing people who've gone up to 300 pounds body weight, people who abuse massive amounts. They combine it with street drugs, party drugs, everything else. That's definitely an issue too. But someone like Mike, he still might not be okay, and that's the thing. How do you know that he's okay? Have you seen his prostate exam? Have you seen his blood work? Do you know what his HDL and triglycerides look like? Have you seen an EKG of his heart? Just because he looks good and he's walking around okay doesn't mean he's 100% healthy either, and that's another thing you have to factor in. So to make such a statement, you need to consider that maybe he's not blasting a lot of gear. Someone who uses 500 milligrams of test a week, that's not a big amount. That seems fairly modest, but if you look at the studies on it, it produced pretty good results when it's real. And what happens if you draw that out over a decade? What happens if someone uses 500 milligrams for a decade and they throw in a little growth hormone? I mean, that's the difference you're dealing with. That's relatively mild, but the person is going to make continual gains for a decade or two doing something like that. It's totally possible. All right, next question. Hey Jason, I watched your video about the 6 lat exercises you don't need where you said it made no sense to do T-bar rows with one arm, and I couldn't agree more. With that in mind, over the years I've seen guys in the gym doing single arm exercises, particularly dumbbell shoulder presses. It's always made no sense to me, so why are people doing this? And am I missing something? Your thoughts? Thanks. As far as single presses, if you're talking about someone seated doing them, yeah, that doesn't make any sense biomechanically, because you're dealing with a light enough weight, there's not going to be much core difference. And I mean, people could say, well, you could get some extra core development doing T-bar rows with one arm. But again, you're talking about an exercise with the way that it pulls on you, maybe not much more so than just doing them with 2 arms together. When you're dealing with something like a push press, there is a potential carryover. So if someone is doing a standing push press with a dumbbell with one arm, there is certain core activation things going on, and there is the potential for certain sport specific applications, meaning a boxer, a martial artist, a shot putter, people like that, there can be some specificity of training there. It could be sport specific. The guys you see doing it, if they're standing and doing a push press with one arm, you might be dealing with someone who competes in a sport of some type where they need an explosive press or throw or punch while standing on their feet one arm at a time, in which case there is some specificity of training for their sport. And so there's a big difference between people doing something for general buildup and general strength overall versus a sport specific application. And I would lean in the direction that hopefully if they're doing it that way, it's a sport specific. Now if they're just doing a seated one arm dumbbell and alternating it or whatever, no, that doesn't make any sense physiologically. They could get out of there twice as fast if they just did both at the same time, because it's not going to really change the load they're using differently, whereas in like the one arm push press can with a sport specific carryover. All right, next question. Recommendations for performing deadlifts and squats with a sensitive lower back. Goal is maintain and build hamstrings, quads, and strengthen back, but lower back sensitivity impedes my training. Can you recommend the best accessory exercises as a workout? Thanks. A lot of this comes down to the fact, and someone else addressed this in there, and they're right. It's possibly a case of you're a noob who doesn't know how to brace their core correctly. They don't know how to brace their back correctly on some of these exercises. You possibly have a weak core in general. And again, maybe mobility issues. So I would say, in my experience of the different things going on, number one, you possibly have a weak core if you're actually having a lower back pains doing these exercises. You have a weak core, you need to do more core work, more standing crunches, more planks, weighted planks, things like that. Strengthen your core up. All right, that's what you have to do. That's possibly a weak link. Number two, maybe you have hamstrings that are a little too tight. That can also cause problems, particularly lower back pain on the squatting. Start stretching your hamstrings more. Maybe do some Romanian deadlifts to help you with hamstring flexibility just a little bit. That can be another thing that's helpful. And number three, you need to learn how to brace your core correctly doing these exercises. Now that is the purpose of a belt, and that's the reason people use belts, is because they brace their core against it. And it's a training tool for that. But then of course sometimes when they take the belt off, they don't know how to do it again. But when you think about it in those terms of you have a full lungs, if you get a really deep breath and contract your abs a little bit when you do these exercises, you brace them and get them tight, and you have a full lungs, deep breaths, and you don't exhale till you're actually in the lifting the exercise on the concentric portion, you'll probably find that your core will brace a lot better. It'll brace itself a lot better, and you might find this lower back sensitivity goes away completely. All right, next question. I've got really tight shoulders, can't get my hands behind my ears enough to do a low bar squat. I can just get the bar in my fingertips. What can I do for my shoulders to get under the bar better? You know what, that is a shoulder mobility issue, but that's not the end of the world, because actually you only need the fingertips. You only need your fingers over the bar on a squat. You don't actually have to grip the bar. And sometimes gripping the bar can cause you shoulder problems and everything later. But there's a lot of factors going on, because I don't know what your training experience is or what you do for a living. It could be the possibility of just a tightness of your shoulders the way that you're thinking of, because you're anterior dominant. You've done too much chest pressing, too much pressing and not enough pulling. So you need to start doing more pulling. You need to start doing face pulls, band pull aparts, things like that. And you also need to start stretching your chest and stretching your shoulders out a lot more. And it's particularly a problem for people who've either overdeveloped their chest and front delts from too much pressing compared to pulling. And it's also common with people who have jobs that require them to keep their arms in front of them for very long periods of time. Again, with Brittany, because she's a hair, makeup, and special effects artist, she has problems with this that we've had to work on because her arms are up in front of her all the time. People who sometimes they're at a computer for 8 hours straight typing. People who, again, artists like her, drivers, truck drivers, things like that, that can become a problem for them over time. And what you have to do with that is to correct a lot of that by doing a lot more pulling exercises, and even throwing in extra face pulls and things and stretching to help sort all of that out. Alright guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.